The first time I heard the click of a rifle hammer behind me, I was already holding a piece of paper that could get a man killed. The night wind off the Brazos tasted like dust and old rain, and the only light came from a thin slice of moon and that pale shimmer of water down below. I had one step left before the bluff dropped away, and one breath left before someone decided whether I was a messenger or a target. Welcome back to Savage West Stories. Pull in close, like we're sharing the same fire, because this one starts the way a lot of frontier travel starts. Quiet, cold, and already too late to pretend you didn't see it. Now, you and I should begin with what I can say for sure and what I can't. The sure part is the place. Central Texas, when the old borders were still fresh scars and everybody with a deed acted like the Almighty had signed it personally. Fort Graham was up near the Brazos by then. Rough timbers, hard rules, and tired men trying to hold a line that never stayed put. That much is ink and wood history. The sure part is the pressure, too. Treaties made far away, promises spoken by men who wouldn't be the ones bleeding when those promises broke. You've seen that kind of math before. The people who write the rules usually aren't the ones who pay for them. The less sure part is the names. I can't point you to a clean government ledger and say, here, Chief Iron Bear, right there in black ink, the way you can with some of the better-known Comanche leaders. But I've held a brittle family letter in my hands, passed down like a bruise with a cracked seal and careful handwriting. And I've read a translated oral account recorded years later, an old man's memory put into another man's words, where a Pentecost leader's name comes out in English as Iron Bear. That's how frontier history works. Sometimes it's ink, sometimes it's smoke, sometimes it's both, and you still don't get a straight answer. A Bagel Hawthorne, though, she's the kind of person who shows up in the margins of real life. Not famous, not celebrated, just necessary. A widow on a small spread, living too far from neighbors to borrow comfort and too close to danger to ever sleep easy. You'll find her in the kind of records nobody reads for fun. Land office notes, probate whispers, the quiet paperwork of survival. And Takakota, he's harder. I won't tell you he's verified the way a fort is verified. I'll tell you he appears in stories that cling to details nobody invents just to sound good. A scar across the ribs, a strange practical way of tying a saddle blanket, a habit of counting time by moons and weather instead of calendars. When different tellings agree on those kinds of things, I tend to listen. A Bagel's place sat where the prairie broke into scrub. Mesquite and live oak hunched low like they'd learned to duck. A shallow draw carried water when it felt generous, and when it didn't, it carried dust and resentment. She kept chickens, a garden that fought the soil every season, and a milk cow that had survived more droughts than some man. If you're picturing her with a soft glow around her, don't. She was in her early 30s and looked older in the eyes, like most people who've buried family without a church bell to mark it. Fever had taken her husband and one child when the winters turned damp and mean. After that, she stayed, because leaving meant admitting the land had beaten her, and because out there, stubbornness is sometimes the last thing you actually own. Now think about that for a second. The frontier wasn't just a map with blank spaces. It was a daily argument. Who gets to stay? Who has to move? Who gets called lawful? Who gets called savage? And who pays the price when two different answers collide? Abigail didn't talk politics, not the way men in town talked it anyway. She talked weather, seeds, salt, and whether the river was up. She talked about what she could control, because that's how you stay sane in a place that can take everything from you overnight. But politics found her anyway. It always does. It found her in the river trails that ran like hidden roads. It found her in the sound of distant hoofbeats that didn't belong to her neighbor. And it found her in that single moment that makes a story turn. A moment where you don't get to choose what kind of trouble exists. You only get to choose what kind of person you are when it steps into your yard. Because in that country, you can do everything right and still end up staring at the wrong end of a gun. You can mind your own business and still have someone else's war wash up on your doorstep like driftwood. So when you hear that rifle hammer click in the dark, when the wind goes sharp and the river looks like black glass below, understand something. That sound isn't just metal on metal. It's the frontier asking a question, and it doesn't ask politely. It started with horses. Out there, a horse wasn't just an animal. A horse was food on the hoof, speed when you needed to run, and the difference between getting home before dark or not getting home at all. You lose a horse on the frontier, and you don't just lose property, you lose options. And when people run out of options, they start reaching for excuses and rifles in the same motion. Along the Brazos, horses began vanishing like someone was plucking them off the land with invisible hands. Settlers lost stock one week, Comanche lost mounts the next, and you can probably guess what happened after that. Nobody blamed bad luck, nobody blamed hunger. They blamed whoever they already feared. In the nearest little settlement, barely more than a store, a few cabins, and a corral that leaned like an old drunk, men started forming what they called patrols. I've read enough frontier paperwork to know what that word usually meant. Young men with rifles, older men with grudges, and not a lot of patience for the kind of truth that takes time to find. That's where Abigail Hawthorne's story stops being quiet. She found Takakota at the edge of her corral fence right before dusk, that hour when the sky goes bruised peach and every shadow starts looking like a man with bad intentions. He was on foot, and that alone was wrong. Comanche riders didn't walk unless something had gone badly, or unless they wanted to be found. His shirt was torn, ash had settled in his hair like he'd come through smoke, and his left arm hung stiff at his side, not dangling loose, but held in that careful way people hold pain when they've been taught never to show it. He didn't rush her, didn't shout, didn't wave a weapon to prove he had one. He just stood there, still as a fence post, watching her the way a wounded animal watches a farmer, trying to decide if the next thing coming is mercy or a rope. Abigail already had her rifle in hand. She learned long ago you don't go fetching a gun after danger introduces itself. The only safe people on the frontier are the ones who haven't lived long enough to be surprised. Takakota spoke first, soft and controlled. Not English, not Spanish. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the shape of the moment. He wasn't begging, he wasn't threatening. He was offering a choice. Then he took one slow step forward and lowered a small bundle at his feet. After that, he lifted both hands, palms out, like he was saying, "I'm not here to take." Abigail didn't move for a second. Now think about that. She's alone. It's near dark. A Comanche youth has walked onto her land. Every story she's ever heard says this ends one way, and still she doesn't shoot. She could have. She could have done the thing that would have made men in town clap her on the back later. She could have aimed center mass and called it frontier justice. A lot of people would have praised her for it. But she didn't. Instead, she spoke in a low, steady voice. "Sit down." He didn't move, so she pointed to the ground again, a hard little gesture that said she wasn't asking twice. "Sit. I could see you're hurt." Here's where things get complicated. Courage is easy when you're angry. It's harder when you're afraid and still choose not to pull the trigger. Takakota's eyes stayed locked on her, not pleading, not apologizing, just measuring. And for a moment, it wasn't about two peoples and old wars. It was about one wounded kid and one woman who'd had enough death for a lifetime. He lowered himself slowly, careful, like his body was arguing with itself. Dust puffed around his boots when he settled. His arm didn't relax. It stayed stiff, guarded, like it belonged to a man twice his age. Abigail stepped a little closer, close enough to smell smoke and sweat, close enough to see the truth in the wound. It wasn't a clean cut. It looked like a glancing shot or a fragment, lead tearing flesh and leaving splinters of pain behind. His breathing was shallow, controlled. He'd been taught to keep it that way. Abigail went back to her cabin without turning her back on him too long. Came out with water, cloth, and a small knife, the kind of knife you use for work, not for glory. When she knelt beside him, he flinched once, just once. Then he held still. Abigail worked in silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because words can turn into lies out there, and lies get people killed faster than bullets. She washed the wound, cleaned out grit, wrapped it tight. No tenderness, no cruelty, just the practical care of someone who knows that infection is a quieter killer than any raid. When she finished, she leaned back on her heels and asked the question that mattered. Who did this? He didn't understand the words, so she pointed west and mimed a rifle. He watched her hands, then nodded once. His jaw tightened in something that looked a lot like disgust. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of cloth. Blue calico, the kind sold in American stores, the kind you'd see on a bolt behind a counter, or on a woman's dress in a settlement that likes to pretend it's civilized. Abigail stared at it. On its own, it wasn't proof of anything. Cloth gets traded, cloth gets stolen, cloth gets taken off a dead man. But the way he held it, like evidence, like an accusation, told her what he wanted her to see. Somebody from town had been close enough for their cloth to end up with Comanche blood on it. And if a wounded youth was bringing that to her fence, it meant he wasn't asking for pity. He was warning her. This wasn't just Indians raiding settlers. Somebody was stirring the pot. Somebody wanted both sides angry and blind. Abigail's neighbors would have heard that and doubled down on violence. That's the easy answer. Fear loves company. But Abigail didn't look at Takakota like a monster in that moment. She looked at him like a person who'd been hurt. Takakota lowered himself to the ground the way a proud man does it when he's hurt. Slow, controlled, eyes never leaving the person who could decide his fate. He didn't slouch. He didn't curl up. He sat upright in the dust beside Abigail's fence like he was refusing to give pain the satisfaction of seeing him bend. Abigail stepped closer, and the first thing she noticed wasn't the blood. It was the smell. Smoke, sweat, and that dry Texas dirt that gets into everything and never really leaves. His wound wasn't a clean slice. It looked like the kind of injury you get when lead tears past you instead of through you. Enough to shred flesh, not enough to finish the job. She didn't talk much. Out there, words can turn into trouble, and trouble has a way of outliving the people who started it. Abigail backed toward her cabin without turning her back for too long. She came out again with a tin cup of water, a strip of clean cloth, and her smallest blade, the kind of blade meant for work, not drama. When she knelt beside him, Takakota flinched once, just once, a quick flash of instinct. Then he locked down again, jaw tight, breathing shallow and steady like he'd practiced it his whole life. Abigail worked carefully. Water first, slow and cold. Then the cloth, wiping grit and dried blood away in measured strokes. She used the knife only when she had to, just enough to lift out debris and keep the wound from turning into something worse. Infection didn't care about pride or tribe. Infection killed you the same either way. When she finally wrapped the bandage and tied it tight, she leaned back on her heels and studied him for a beat. The danger hadn't vanished. It had only changed shape. She asked him who did it, and he didn't understand the words. So she did what people have always done when language fails. She pointed west, then mimed a rifle. Takakota watched her hands, then nodded once. His jaw tightened, not fear, not shame, more like disgust. And then he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a strip of blue calico. That kind of cloth wasn't rare, but it was specific, the sort of fabric you'd see behind the counter of a frontier store, stacked in bolts, sold by the yard. Abigail stared at it, and you could almost feel the gears turning in her head. Cloth gets traded. Cloth gets stolen. Cloth gets taken off bodies. On its own, it proved nothing, but the way he held it did. He wasn't offering it like a gift. He was holding it like evidence. It wasn't just that Takakota had been shot. It was the suggestion that someone from the settlers' side had been close enough for their cloth to end up in his hands with blood on it. And if he'd come to Abigail with that,
Wounded and alone, it meant he wanted her to understand one thing very clearly. This wasn't just the old story of raids and reprisals. Somebody was stoking the fire on purpose. When dusk slipped deeper and the sky turned the color of bruised fruit, Takakota didn't ask to come inside. Abigail didn't invite him. Both of them understood that a roof isn't just shelter on the frontier. A roof is trust, and trust is a currency that spends fast and comes back slow. So he stayed outside, near the lean-to where she kept tools and feed, close enough to be seen, far enough to keep a line between them. That night was the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. The wind moved through the scrub, the grass whispered against itself, and every sound seemed like it could be the start of something. Abigail didn't sleep much. You don't when you've got a wounded stranger on your land and a history of blood between the worlds you both come from. Before dawn, Takakota was up. Abigail saw him through the thin light, testing his arm carefully, wincing just a little when the bandage pulled. He looked east, toward the flatland and the faint trail that led toward the fort and the settlements beyond. Abigail stepped out with a tin cup of coffee. Weak coffee, the kind you make when supplies are thin and you still need the comfort of something warm. Steam curled off it in the cool morning air. She held it out without stepping too close. Takakota hesitated, not because he didn't want it, but because taking something from someone can feel like owing them. Then he reached out and accepted the cup, careful, fingers steady, eyes never quite leaving her face. And that's when she surprised him. He spoke a few words of English, not many, just enough to be dangerous. "Men, come," he said, slow and rough, like each word cost him effort. Abigail didn't ask which men. She didn't have to. Her whole body tightened up as if the warning had grabbed her by the collar. She asked the next question anyway, because you do that when you're trying to find the shape of the threat. "Your father?" Takakota nodded once. Then he touched his chest, like he was naming something that carried weight, and said it carefully, with the kind of pronunciation you use when you know the name matters. "Iron Bear." And there it was, a name that didn't sound like a rumor anymore, a name with hooves behind it. Abigail stood there in the first thin light of morning, coffee cooling in her hands, the wind already picking up dust from the yard. One night ago, Takakota was a stranger at her fence. Now he was a warning with a bandage on his arm and a leader's name on his tongue. Out on the frontier, you don't get much time between the moment you learn trouble is coming.
That name, Iron Bear, hit Abigail like a stone dropped into still water. You could see it on her face. Not panic exactly, more like the moment your mind stops pretending the world is simple. And Takakota, sitting there with that fresh bandage on his arm, didn't give her a speech. He didn't try to soften it. He just pointed to her cabin, then down at the dirt, and dragged his finger in a rough circle right there near her boots. Slow, deliberate, like he was carving a boundary into the earth. Then he brought his hands together in a clasping motion, an agreement, a promise, or maybe a warning, depending on how you look at it. He was trying to say, my father is coming here, and this place matters. This ground will mean something when he arrives. Now, think about that for a second. You're a widow on a lonely spread, and the only person giving you a heads up is a Comanche youth you bandaged less than a day ago. No neighbors nearby, no fort within shouting distance, just a cabin, a fence, and whatever courage you can scrape together before the sun gets high. The morning came fast, like it does in Texas. The mist burned off in a hurry, and the air started warming before Abigail even had time to settle her nerves. Then she heard it. Hooves. Not the scattered rhythm of one rider, not the casual clip of a man out checking stock. This was measured, organized, the kind of approach that tells you whoever's coming isn't lost and isn't guessing. Abigail stepped up on her porch with her rifle where it could be seen. Not raised, not hidden, just there. A plain statement,
I'm not helpless, and I'm not looking for a fight I can't win." Out of the mesquite and scrub came a line of riders, maybe a couple dozen, give or take, moving like they'd practiced it, faces marked with light paint, not drenched in the kind of war colors settlers love to describe when they're trying to scare each other. Weapons were present, sure, you don't ride these lands unarmed, but nothing was lifted, nothing was aimed. And at the front was a man who didn't need to shout to make the air feel smaller. Chief Iron Bear, if that's the name he carried, rode with the kind of posture that tells you people listen when he speaks, not because they're forced to, because they've learned what happens when they don't. Takakuta moved up beside him, bandaged arm held close, looking a lot less like a wounded trespasser now, and a lot more like someone with a place in that group. He said something to the older man, quick and quiet, and Iron Bear's gaze came up to the porch. Not hatred, not surprise, assessment. The riders stopped at a distance that felt intentional, and the dust they'd kicked up drifted forward in the sunlight like a thin veil. Horses shifted and snorted, but nobody surged, nobody rushed. Then Iron Bear dismounted. 2 others did too. They didn't swagger, they didn't posture, they simply stepped down, steady and controlled, and started walking toward Abigail with their hands visible and empty. That detail matters. On the frontier, showing your hands is a language all its own. Movin moved with them, just a half step back, the way a translator does when the words aren't his to own. And when they stopped a short distance from the porch, Takakuta spoke in clipped, careful English, barely enough, but enough. Iron Bear wanted to know why Abigail had helped his son. You could feel the question hanging there like a rope, because it wasn't just curiosity, it was a test. It was a probe into her character. If she answered wrong, there might not be another conversation. Abigail didn't dress it up. She didn't try to sound noble. She said something close to the truth, that she was tired of watching people die for pride, that a wounded man bleeding on her land was still a human being, even if he came from the wrong side of the stories. Takakoda translated. You could see him tighten up a little, like he knew the idea might not land cleanly in his father's world, but he said it anyway. Iron Bear listened without interruption, then he spoke back in his own language, calm but edged. The cadence wasn't angry, exactly. It was the cadence of someone talking about things he's seen too many times. Takakoda turned and translated the meaning, not word for word, but close enough for the truth to carry. He said his father believed the land remembers pride, and the land remembers blood. That's not poetry, that's experience. The kind of experience you only get when you've watched the same mistakes repeat until they start looking like tradition. Then Iron Bear said the part that made Abigail's throat go dry. Someone was stealing horses. Someone was leaving signs behind, tracks, scraps, little pieces of evidence meant to point in one direction so that Comanche camps and settler cabins would blame each other and do what angry people always do, fight. Now here's where things get complicated, because once you accept that, you can't keep telling yourself the story is simple. It's not just us versus them, it's also about the men who profit when us and them stay at each other's throats. Abigail stood there on that porch, sunlight on her face, dust in her mouth, rifle still leaning against the post, and for a moment she didn't look like a woman facing enemies. She looked like someone just realized she'd stepped into a bigger game than she ever wanted to play. Iron Bear's eyes stayed on her, steady and unreadable. Takakoda watched her too, like he was waiting to see whether she'd deny what she already knew. And Abigail, she gave a small nod. Not surrender, not agreement, recognition. Because deep down she'd suspected it the moment she saw that blood-stained cloth, and now a Comanche chief is standing in her yard saying the same thing. That was the point where the air changed, where this stopped being a strange meeting at a fence line and became the start of something that could burn across a whole stretch of Texas if nobody was careful. Abigail's throat went dry, but she didn't look away.
When Takakota finished translating, she gave a small nod, just enough to admit what her gut had already been whispering since the moment she saw that blood-stained calico. Iron Bear's gaze followed hers out toward the east, toward the direction of the settlements and the fort beyond them, and Takakota's English came slower now, like the meaning was heavier than the words. His father was saying it plain. If nothing changed, there would be a fight. Settler men would come hunting. Young Comanche men would answer. And Abigail, whether she wanted it or not, was standing in the middle of that coming storm. Abigail almost laughed, but it didn't have any humor in it. "I didn't ask to be between," she said. Iron Bear didn't blink. He just looked at her like the land itself was speaking through him. "None of us ask, not out there. The frontier doesn't hand you choices wrapped in ribbon. It hands you consequences and waits to see what you do with them." Then Iron Bear offered her something, and it wasn't gold, and it wasn't praise. It was a responsibility. He wasn't talking about peace like people in towns like to talk about peace, like it's a hymn you sing and everything settles down. He was talking about a different kind of peace, the kind where fewer people die for stupid reasons, the kind where you stop a fire before it becomes a wall of flame. Takakota translated while his father spoke, and the message came through clear enough. Someone was framing both sides, not with courtroom proof, not with a neat confession, with frontier proof, the kind that shows up in your hands and in your wounds. A saddle taken off a raider, stamped with a maker's mark from a shop near settler country. A spent lead ball pulled from flesh, the size and shape matching what local patrols carried. Little pieces that don't mean much alone, but together start pointing in a direction nobody wants to admit. Iron Bear wanted Abigail to carry a warning to the fort. Not a threat, a warning. Someone was lighting a fuse, and if the fort backed the wrong men, if it looked the other way while volunteers rode out pretending to be justice, the Brazos country would erupt. Cabins would burn, camps would burn. Children would die in places they'd never even heard the word treaty. Abigail didn't like any of it. She didn't like being asked, she didn't like being needed, and she sure didn't like being anyone's messenger. Messengers are the first ones blamed when the message turns out to be something nobody wants to hear. Out there, you can get shot for telling the truth, and you can get shot for telling a lie. The only difference is what your conscience does afterwards, if you live long enough to find out. She looked at Takakota, still young, still carrying that sharp edge of hope that hadn't been completely worn down yet. And then she looked at Iron Bear, older, harder, the kind of man who'd buried hope under necessity and kept moving because stopping meant dying. And she thought about the men back in town, the ones who believed safety came from being the first to pull the trigger, not the last. "Why me?" she asked, not soft, not pleading, like she was challenging the logic. Takakota answered before his father could, his English blunt and spare. "Because you are known, white woman, alone. They listen more than if I go." Abigail gave him a look sharp enough to peel bark off a tree. "Listen," she muttered, "or hang me." Takakota's mouth twitched like he almost smiled, then he caught himself and let it die. "Maybe," he said, as if that was just the honest math of it. Iron Bear stepped closer and reached into a small hide pouch at his belt. Abigail didn't extend her hand, not yet. Gifts can be chains in any culture, and on the frontier they can be worse than chains. They can be misunderstandings that never get untangled. Iron Bear opened the wrap himself and revealed a narrow silver band, plain and worn at the edges. Not something meant to impress, something meant to endure. Takakota translated again. His father said it meant she would speak true. If she lied, it shamed her. If they lied, it shamed them. In a place where written contracts meant about as much as the man enforcing them, honor was the closest thing to a signature both sides recognized. Abigail hesitated, feeling the weight of that metal without even touching it. Then she reached out and took it. She slid it over her hand and onto her wrist. The silver felt cold against her skin, cold like river stones. And with that one motion, the conversation changed. It wasn't friendly, it wasn't safe, but it was real. Now think about that for a second. A widow on a porch, a Comanche chief in her yard, and a piece of silver standing in for a treaty that no government had the spine to enforce. That's the frontier for you. Big forces, tiny objects, and lives balanced on whether someone keeps their word. Abigail didn't waste time after that.
She stepped down off the porch and moved toward her corral with the kind of purpose you see in people who've made a decision they don't enjoy. She saddled her mare fast but careful, hands sure on the cinch, checking leather like a person who understands that a broken strap can kill you as dead as a bullet. She swung up into the saddle, skirts settling, spine straight. Takakota rode with her when she left, not close enough to make a show of it, close enough to make sure she reached the fort alive, and two other riders peeled off into the scrub as shadows, there but not there, close enough to watch, far enough that settlers wouldn't see 'em and decide to stop listening and start aiming. The sun sunk lower as they pushed out into the open prairie. The cabin behind Abigail grew smaller until it looked like just another dark shape on a big, indifferent land. And Abigail rode toward Fort Graham with a warning that might save lives or might get her killed before she ever reached the gate. Because once you accept being between, you don't get to pretend you're just a bystander anymore. Out there, the land remembers pride. It remembers blood. And now it was going to remember what Abigail did next.
Brushline was the kind of place that sounded hopeful only because the people who named it needed hope. A line in the brush, a claim scratched on the land that didn't care who claimed it. By the time Abigail rode in at dusk, the whole settlement smelled like sweat, wood smoke, and fear, pretending it was confidence. Heads turned as she came down the main track. Folks knew her, the widow who didn't remarry, the woman who didn't fold and head back east. Men on the frontier respect that kind of backbone, and some of them resent it too, because it makes them feel smaller than they want to feel. She tied off her mare and walked straight into the general store. Barrels and sacks stacked high, a pot-bellied stove squatting in the corner like an old animal, and that thin, dusty light slanting in through the windows. Ellsworth stood behind the counter with ink-stained fingers and the careful posture of a man who survives by hearing everything and saying very little. His eyes dropped to her wrist almost immediately. "New jewelry, Abigail?" he asked. She didn't bother explaining. "Found it," she said, flat as a shovel. "Now think about that for a second. On the frontier, a plain piece of silver can speak louder than a sermon. It can mean money. It can mean marriage. Or it can mean you've been standing too close to the wrong people." Abigail leaned in, keeping her voice low, and asked the questions that mattered. Horses, patrols, who was riding and why. Ellsworth's mouth tightened, the way it does when a man knows the truth will make the room colder. "Rangers came through," he said. "Not federal boys, volunteers. They're talking about teaching the Comanche a lesson. Say the fort's too slow." That phrase, volunteer justice, has a way of turning blood into a hobby. It doesn't wait for facts. It doesn't wait for permission. It just finds an excuse and rides. Abigail didn't linger. She stepped out into the street, swung into the saddle, and left Brushline behind with the sun dropping fast at her back. The prairie swallowed her the way it always does, and the sky turned dark and heavy, like it was holding its breath. She rode hard through the night. Coyotes yipped out on the flats. Every so often her mare's ears snapped forward at something Abigail couldn't see. And if you've ever traveled that country, you know the rule. Trust a horse's fear. Horses don't lie. They don't care about pride. They just want to live. Near midnight, she finally saw Fort Graham. Not a castle, not a promise, just a rough rectangle of timber and tired men. Lantern light leaking through cracks like the place was barely containing itself. At the gate, the sentry lifted his rifle. "Identify yourself." "Abigail Hawthorne," she called. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge." They let her in after enough suspicion to remind her she wasn't family here. Inside the fort yard, everything was quiet and worn. A couple of soldiers hunched over cards under lantern light, trying to forget where they were. That's how a lot of frontier soldiers lived, half awake even when they were asleep. They brought Abigail to the officer on duty, a lieutenant, not old, not green, clean cuffs, tired eyes, the kind of man who still believed order mattered, even though the world kept proving otherwise. He listened. That alone was unusual. Abigail laid it out plainly. The horse thefts, the signs being planted, the fact that Comanche leadership believed someone was trying to push both sides into a fight.
She didn't ask him to love the Comanche. She didn't ask him to trust them. She asked him to understand that a war started with lies. It's still a war, and it still kills the innocent first. The lieutenant sat back, fingers steepled, and asked the question she'd been dreading. "How do you know this?" Abigail hesitated just long enough to be human. Then she said it. A wounded Comanche youth had come to her fence. His father wanted to avoid a war he believed someone was trying to buy. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "You've been in contact with Comanche leadership?" "Yes." He leaned back farther, chair creaking like an old argument. "You realize how that sounds?" Abigail didn't flinch. "I realize how blood sounds. It's louder." That landed, not like an apology, like a fact. The lieutenant stood up and opened a cabinet, pulling out papers and spreading them across the desk. Reports, complaints, requests, frontier bureaucracy stacked up like sandbags against a flood. One notice in the pile caught his attention. A volunteer ranger outfit had requested supplies and permission to recover stolen stock. Abigail's stomach tightened. Permission? The lieutenant's mouth pulled into a thin line. They don't always wait for it. "And will you stop 'em?" Abigail asked. He rubbed his face with one hand, the gesture of a man caught between duty and politics. "Mrs. Hawthorne, this fort exists because settlers demanded protection. If I move against them without proof, I'll have half the county calling for my removal." There it was, the machine, the ugly truth that forts weren't built to protect everyone. They were built to protect certain people at certain times, as long as it didn't cost the wrong kind of political pain. Abigail felt anger rise, hot and useless. "So you'll let 'em ride out and start a war you can't finish?" The lieutenant's gaze sharpened. "Or I'll send a runner, or I'll ride myself and try to keep it from getting out of hand." Here's where things get complicated. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a coward. He was a man trying to hold a fragile line with limited authority, surrounded by civilians who thought their fear gave them the right to become an army. Abigail left the office with no guarantee in her pocket, just the thin hope that caution could outrun pride. She stepped back into the night, mounted up, and rode out through the fort gate. The lantern glow faded behind her, and the prairie opened wide again, cold, silent, and ready to swallow whatever came next.
Abigail didn't make it far from Fort Graham before she heard it. Hoofbeats behind her. Not one rider, not a small pair. Multiple horses moving fast, the rhythm too steady to be lost travelers and too hungry to be friendly company. The prairie at night has a way of carrying sound farther than it should, and those hooves came in like a warning you can't ignore. She didn't run down the trail. Running turns you into prey. Instead, she eased her mare off the main track and into the scrub, letting mesquite swallow her shape. Branches brushed her skirt and snagged at her coat. The mare didn't like it, but she trusted Abigail enough to follow. Abigail slid down out of the saddle and crouched low, rifle across her lap. No panic, no big movements, just a woman making herself small in a land that punishes the careless. Now think about that for a second. The movies will tell you courage is charging out into the open with a gun raised. Real courage is often quieter. It's knowing when to disappear. The riders came into view a moment later. White men, not Comanche. Hats, coats, rifles slung casual, like they belonged to the land by virtue of holding a weapon. Volunteer rangers, the kind of men who called themselves law because no one else had the spine to correct them. They pulled up near where Abigail had left the trail, close enough that the moonlight showed the dust on their boots and the tight set of their mouths. The one in front was broad-shouldered, with a beard that looked like it hadn't met soap in a long time. He called her name like they were old friends. "Abigail Hawthorne," he said, smiling. "Riding late." She didn't return the smile. She stepped out just enough to be seen, rifle still low, and asked, "What do you want?" He grinned wider. "Heard you been talking to the fort. Heard you got opinions about who's stealing horses." Abigail kept her voice even. "I have opinions about men who want war because it makes them feel big." A couple of the riders laughed, but it wasn't friendly.
It was the kind of laugh men use to make themselves feel safe while they do something ugly. The leader's smile thinned. "You got a Comanche lover riding shadow for you, Abigail?" That line hit like a slap, not just because it was crude, because it told her something important. They were watching. Maybe they'd seen a sign, maybe they were guessing and hoping she'd flinch. Either way, it meant they were close to the truth, and close to doing something stupid with it. "I travel alone," Abigail lied. Smooth, simple, the kind of lie you tell when the truth would kill you. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, voice softening as if he was offering a favor. "You're gonna come with us. Captain wants a word. Just a word, no harm." Abigail didn't believe him for a heartbeat. Her grip tightened on the rifle, but she didn't raise it yet. One wrong motion and those men would use it as an excuse to bury her in the prairie. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The leader sighed, like she was being inconvenient. Then he nodded to two of his men. They swung down from their saddles and started walking toward her, hands reaching like they were about to grab a stray dog. Abigail brought the rifle up, not firing, not even aiming at a face, just leveling it enough to stop their feet. "Back," she said. They froze, not because they respected her, because the muzzle of a gun has a way of making people honest. The leader's eyes hardened. "You don't point a gun at Texans and live long." And right then, from behind them, out of the darkness, a calm young voice cut through the night in careful English. "He is under protection." Takakota stepped into the moonlight like he'd been there the whole time. Injured arm held close, posture balanced, eyes steady. Two other Comanche riders appeared farther back, half swallowed by mesquite. Quiet horses, quiet men. The kind of quiet that tells you they weren't surprised. They were prepared. The volunteers stiffened in their saddles. One of them whispered something that sounded like prayer. Takakota didn't raise a weapon. He didn't have to. His presence was a fuse held close to flame. The leader swallowed, then tried to puff himself up again. "Boy, you don't belong here." Takakota's eyes didn't blink. "You do not belong on our horses." That was the truth, sharp and simple. And in that kind of truth, there's a challenge, a dare. Abigail felt the moment tipping, one insult away from gunfire, one twitch away from bodies in the dust. So she did the one thing most people forget they can do when men start circling like wolves. She took control of the conversation. "Stop," she snapped, sharp as a whip. "All of you." For a second, everybody looked at her like they'd forgotten she was there, like she was the center of this entire problem. Abigail lowered the rifle just enough to speak without shouting. She looked at the leader and said, "If your captain wants words, tell him he can find me at my place, in daylight, with witnesses. Otherwise, you can ride on." The leader's jaw worked. He wanted to do something dramatic, something that would restore his pride. But pride doesn't stop bullets, and he could see the Comanche riders well enough now to understand the math. Instead, he spat into the dirt. "This ain't over." Then they turned and rode off, too fast, too loud. Men who want you to know they're not afraid, even as their horses kick up a dust trail like a retreat banner. Abigail didn't move until the sound faded, and the night swallowed him. Only then did she breathe. Takakota stepped closer, eyes dropping to the silver band on her wrist. His face was calm, but there was a warning underneath it. "My father will not like this," he said. Abigail stared into the dark where the volunteers had vanished. "Neither will mine, if I had one," she answered, dry as bone. Takakota didn't smile. Maybe he didn't understand that kind of humor. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't find anything funny about the way the frontier turns people into targets for doing the right thing. The wind moved through the mesquite again. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and Abigail stood there with her rifle and her silver band, realizing she'd just stepped into a war that hadn't started yet, but was already looking for a place to land.
Brushline was the kind of place that sounded hopeful only because the people who named it needed hope. A line in the brush, a claim scratched on the land that didn't care who claimed it.
By the time Abigail rode in at dusk, the whole settlement smelled like sweat, wood smoke, and fear, pretending it was confidence. Heads turned as she came down the main track. Folks knew her, the widow who didn't remarry, the woman who didn't fold and head back east. Men on the frontier respect that kind of backbone, and some of them resent it too, because it makes them feel smaller than they want to feel. She tied off her mare and walked straight into the general store. Barrels and sacks stacked high, a pot-bellied stove squatting in the corner like an old animal, and that thin, dusty light slanting in through the windows. Ellsworth stood behind the counter with ink-stained fingers and the careful posture of a man who survives by hearing everything and saying very little. His eyes dropped to her wrist almost immediately. "New jewelry, Abigail?" he asked. She didn't bother explaining. "Found it," she said, flat as a shovel. "Now think about that for a second. On the frontier, a plain piece of silver can speak louder than a sermon. It can mean money. It can mean marriage. Or it can mean you've been standing too close to the wrong people." Abigail leaned in, keeping her voice low, and asked the questions that mattered. Horses, patrols, who was riding and why. Ellsworth's mouth tightened, the way it does when a man knows the truth will make the room colder. "Rangers came through," he said. "Not federal boys, volunteers. They're talking about teaching the Comanche a lesson. Say the fort's too slow." That phrase, volunteer justice, has a way of turning blood into a hobby. It doesn't wait for facts. It doesn't wait for permission. It just finds an excuse and rides. Abigail didn't linger. She stepped out into the street, swung into the saddle, and left brushline behind with the sun dropping fast at her back. The prairie swallowed her the way it always does, and the sky turned dark and heavy, like it was holding its breath. She rode hard through the night. Coyotes yipped out on the flats. Every so often her mare's ears snapped forward at something Abigail couldn't see. And if you've ever traveled that country, you know the rule. Trust a horse's fear. Horses don't lie. They don't care about pride. They just want to live. Near midnight, she finally saw Fort Graham. Not a castle, not a promise, just a rough rectangle of timber and tired men, lantern light leaking through cracks like the place was barely containing itself. At the gate, the sentry lifted his rifle. "Identify yourself." "Abigail Hawthorne," she called. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge." They let her in after enough suspicion to remind her she wasn't family here. Inside the fort yard, everything was quiet and worn. A couple of soldiers hunched over cards under lantern light, trying to forget where they were. That's how a lot of frontier soldiers lived, half awake even when they were asleep. They brought Abigail to the officer on duty, a lieutenant, not old, not green, clean cuffs, tired eyes, the kind of man who still believed order mattered, even though the world kept proving otherwise. He listened. That alone was unusual. Abigail laid it out plainly. The horse thefts, the signs being planted, the fact that Comanche leadership believed someone was trying to push both sides into a fight. She didn't ask him to love the Comanche. She didn't ask him to trust them. She asked him to understand that a war started with lies is still a war, and it still kills the innocent first. The lieutenant sat back, fingers steepled, and asked the question she'd been dreading. "How do you know this?" Abigail hesitated just long enough to be human. Then she said it. A wounded Comanche youth had come to her fence. His father wanted to avoid a war he believed someone was trying to buy. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "You've been in contact with Comanche leadership?" "Yes." He leaned back farther, chair creaking like an old argument. "You realize how that sounds?" Abigail didn't flinch. "I realize how blood sounds. It's louder." That landed, not like an apology, like a fact. The lieutenant stood up and opened a cabinet, pulling out papers and spreading them across the desk. Reports, complaints, requests, frontier bureaucracy stacked up like sandbags against a flood. One notice in the pile caught his attention. A volunteer ranger outfit had requested supplies and permission to recover stolen stock. Abigail's stomach tightened. Permission? The lieutenant's mouth pulled into a thin line. They don't always wait for it. "And will you stop 'em?" Abigail asked. He rubbed his face with one hand. the gesture of a man caught between duty and politics. "Mrs. Hawthorne, this fort exists because settlers demanded protection. If I move against them without proof, I'll have half the county calling for my removal." There it was, the machine, the ugly truth that forts weren't built to protect everyone. They were built to protect certain people at certain times, as long as it didn't cost the wrong kind of political pain. Abigail felt anger rise hot and useless. "So you'll let 'em ride out and start a war you can't finish?" The lieutenant's gaze sharpened. "Or I'll send a runner, or I'll ride myself and try to keep it from getting out of hand." Here's where things get complicated. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't even a coward. He was a man trying to hold a fragile line with limited authority, surrounded by civilians who thought their fear gave them the right to become an army. Abigail left the office with no guarantee in her pocket, just the thin hope that caution could outrun pride. She stepped back into the night, mounted up, and rode out through the fort gate. The lantern glow faded behind her, and the prairie opened wide again, cold, silent, and ready to swallow whatever came next. They met the volunteers at a shallow crossing late in the afternoon, where the river ran low and clear over exposed stone. Cottonwoods leaned over both banks, and the sunlight flashed on the ripples like broken glass. It looked peaceful if you didn't know better, but the frontier has a habit of making the most beautiful places feel like a trap. The volunteers were already there, halted on the near bank, maybe watering their horses, maybe waiting because they'd sensed movement out in the grass. Their leader, the same bearded man who'd tried to snatch Abigail off the trail the night before, sat tall in the saddle, chest out, like posture alone could stop what he'd started. Abigail rode forward alone and stopped at the water's edge, hands visible, shoulders square, no sudden motions. She wasn't trying to win a fight, she was trying to prevent one. Takakota held back on the far side, just out of rifle range, close enough to be seen if someone bothered to look, far enough to keep this from turning into a Comanche attack the moment a nervous finger twitched. The bearded man called out to her with that same mocking tone, the kind of tone men use when they're trying to convince themselves they aren't afraid. Abigail answered calmly. She warned him. She told him the truth they didn't want. If they rode into Comanche camps hunting stolen horses, they'd get men killed who never stole anything. They'd get settlers killed who never held a rifle. And the people who'd been profiting from the thefts would be the only ones smiling when the smoke cleared. Now think about that for a second. It's not just that war is violent, it's that war is convenient for the worst sort of people. The bearded man sneered and demanded proof. So Abigail reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the folded note from Fort Graham. Not some grand proclamation, not a warrant, just enough to show the fort wasn't backing this ride. She held it up in the sunlight so they could see the seal, see that this wasn't just her woman's opinion. The bearded man squinted, then spat and dismissed it like paper meant nothing. And Abigail's voice went colder. She told him what the note really meant out there. If they crossed that line, they'd be doing it as criminals, not protectors. And when the Comanche answered, the fort wouldn't save them from the consequences they'd chosen. For a moment it worked, not because they suddenly grew wise, but because the practical part of their brains did the math. Men like that don't fear death in theory. They fear dying for something that won't look heroic afterwards. Then a young man in their group, barely old enough to shave, lifted his rifle. You could see it happen in slow motion. His hands were shaking, but he kept raising the barrel anyway, aiming across the water at Takakota like he was trying to pin his fear onto a target. Takakota didn't move. No flinch, no reaching for a weapon, just stillness. The kind of stillness that says, "I know what you are and I'm not giving you an excuse." Abigail turned her head just enough to raise one hand toward Takakota, a small, sharp signal. Don't move. Then she faced the volunteers again before the situation could tip over. She tried to pull them back into words. She told them to stop pretending this was justice and admit what it really was, a bargain. She offered them information, names, routes, the kind of talk that could actually lead them to the men buying stolen horses if they turned around right now and swore they wouldn't cross into Comanche camp. The bearded leader laughed like it was absurd to take a woman seriously. Abigail snapped back that they already were. They were just too proud to admit it. And that's when the rifle went off. Not from Takakota, not from Iron Bear's riders, from the trembling boy on the volunteer side. The shot cracked across the water and hit a cottonwood trunk on the far bank, exploding bark into bright splinters. It didn't kill anyone, but it did something almost as dangerous. It proved the first shot had been fired. There was a beat of silence afterwards, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Horses shifted, dust hung in the air. Men's faces went tight, like their bodies were deciding what to do before their minds could catch up. And right there, in that breath between the shot and the answer, you can feel how a whole region could slide into war. No speeches, no declarations, just one scared kid and one loud bang. Abigail didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She kicked her mare forward into the crossing. Water surged around the horse's legs, and the animal resisted like any sensible creature would, but the mare obeyed, pushing through the current and the slick stones with heavy, real effort. Abigail rode straight into the line between the volunteers and the far bank, making herself the closest target if anyone decided to keep shooting. "Stop!" she shouted. "No more shots!" That wasn't romance, that was calculation. Men hesitate when they might hit a woman they recognize, not always because they're good men, sometimes because they don't want to carry that kind of guilt, sometimes because they don't want the story told about them afterwards. Takakota's voice rang out behind her in Comanche, sharp, commanding, not pleading, and up on the ridge line behind him, Iron Bear's riders began to show themselves, not charging, not screaming, just appearing, one by one, as silhouettes with horses beneath them. A warning made of distance and patience. The bearded leader's face went pale as he finally understood the full shape of the moment. He wasn't facing a frightened camp. He was facing disciplined warriors who had been fighting longer than he'd been alive. Abigail lifted the fort note again, damp now at the edges from the crossing spray. She held it high like a final line drawn in the air. She shouted the question that mattered. Did they want to die for a lie, or did they want to go home and find the man actually stealing from them? The bearded man's jaw worked like he was chewing pride. Then, finally, he raised his hand, sharp and desperate, and ordered his men back. Rifles lowered, horses backed away. Not everyone did it with grace, but they did it. Abigail didn't relax until she saw the last barrel tilt down. Only then did she guide her mare through the last of the ripples, heart hammering, wet boots already thinking about the long road ahead.
The volunteers didn't shake hands. Men like that rarely do when they've been forced to swallow their pride. They turned their horses slow at first, then faster than they needed to, backing away from that shallow crossing like the river itself had judged them. Abigail stayed in the water until the last rifle tilted down. Only then did she guide her mare toward the far bank, boots soaked, skirt heavy, heart still thumping like it wanted out of her chest. When she swung down into the wet sand, she didn't look relieved. She looked spent, like someone who'd held a door shut against a storm and knew the hinges might not hold next time. Takakota met her there, close enough now that she could see the tightness around his eyes. He didn't rush in with praise. He just looked at her the way you look at a person who did something you wouldn't have dared to do yourself. "You could have died," he said. Abigail gave him a breathless, ugly little snort. "I'm aware." And for half a second he almost smiled, almost. Then it faded, because out there, near death doesn't feel funny once the dust settles. Up on the ridge line, Iron Bear's riders were still visible, quiet silhouettes, watching. They hadn't charged, they hadn't fired, they'd simply been there, like a shadow you can't outrun. And then Iron Bear himself rode down at a measured pace, not as a conqueror, not as a savior,
just a leader arriving to see what his people might have to answer for. He took in the retreating volunteers, the damp paper in Abigail's hand, the way Takakota held himself. His face didn't give anything away, but his eyes did that thing a seasoned man's eyes do, counting consequences before they happen. He spoke to his father first, brief and low. Takakota translated. "My father says today you stood in the river and did not move. He says you have strong spine." Abigail gave a sharp laugh that had no joy in it. Strong spine doesn't stop bullets. Iron Bear looked at her a long moment, then spoke in careful English, each word placed like a stone. "Bullets do not stop rivers." You can take that however you want. A proverb, a warning, a compliment, maybe all three. Either way, it wasn't softness. It was the kind of respect that still leaves you alone with your choices. Then Takakota translated again, slower this time. "My father says he will not attack brushline now, but he will watch. If horses keep disappearing, if our people are shot again, he will come, and then no widow rides into the water to stop it." Abigail nodded once. Fair. Iron Bear's gaze drifted to the fort note, ink smeared at the edges, paper wrinkled from spray. He said one word like it tasted bitter. Paper. Abigail looked at it. Sometimes paper is all we have before lead. Iron Bear didn't argue. He turned his horse, and that was that. His riders peeled away with him, quiet as they arrived, leaving only hoof prints and the heavy silence after violence doesn't happen. Takakota stayed a moment longer, watching Abigail like he still wasn't sure what to make of her. "You gave 'em names?" he asked. "Not yet," Abigail said, "but I will." Takakota's eyes narrowed. "That is dangerous." Abigail's mouth tightened. So is everything. And then Takakota did something small that carried weight. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a simple twist of rawhide. No beadwork, no show, just plain tough strip. He tied it around the silver band on her wrist, snug and deliberate. Abigail looked down at it. "What's that for?" she asked. Takakota searched for the right words. "So it stays," he said. "So you remember." "Remember what?" she asked. He met her eyes. "That you walked into water with guns pointed. That is not normal." Abigail exhaled, slow. "No," she said, "it isn't." Then he mounted, turned, and rode after his father, leaving Abigail alone on the bank with wet boots and a wrist that suddenly felt heavier than it should. Weeks passed. The borderlands don't heal fast, but they do shift. Horses still went missing, but not like before. The volunteer men nursed their humiliation the way men do, by pretending it was strategy, by telling the story so it sounded like they'd chosen restraint instead of being forced into it. The fort sent patrols that looked official enough to satisfy paperwork and careful enough not to light the wrong fuse. The land stayed the same, the people didn't. And Abigail did what she said she'd do. She listened, she watched, she followed the thread where it led, through quiet deals and 2 friendly bargains and men who suddenly had better horses than their pay could explain. Eventually, it pointed to 2 men in brushline who'd been buying stolen stock from anybody willing to sell, then blaming it on raids because fear is good for business. Men like that don't usually fire the first shot. They just make sure somebody else does. Their punishment wasn't a clean, satisfying ending. No dramatic shootout, no final confession under the sun. The fort arrested 'em on charges that sounded smaller than their sins. One escaped, one didn't. The records are thin, the gossip is thick. That's the West for you. What mattered was that the theft slowed and the fever broke. Not cured, just not killing you today. Takakota came by Abigail's place twice more that season, always at the edge of her land, always respectful of the line. Sometimes he brought news, sometimes he brought nothing but silence and a stare at the horizon like he was measuring time in his head. Iron Bear never returned in person. Leaders rarely do once the message is delivered. But Abigail heard his influence in what didn't happen. A cabin that wasn't burned. A patrol that turned back before it crossed too far. A night that stayed quiet. Now think about that for a second. Sometimes history isn't what explodes. It's what doesn't. Abigail kept the silver band. She kept the rawhide tied around it until it frayed thin from weather and work. She didn't become a saint. She didn't become a legend carved into stone. She became something much harder to live with. A person both sides watched. Because when you step into the river between rifles, you don't get to step back out and pretend you were just passing through.